Hello, and welcome to another installment of our Popular Leaders in Manufacturing Roundtable series. I'm Steve O'Brien, CEO here at Shiftboard, and thank you for joining us today. I also want to extend a warm welcome to our panelists who will be introduced in just a minute. Today's topic is how to combat labor shortages through workforce flexibility. And hardly a day goes by without labor shortages hitting the news, and we're all aware of our favorite product being in short supply or our favorite restaurant working at half capacity. And businesses of all shapes and sizes are doing everything they can to hire and retain their talent. But the pressure is on, and the pressure and stress on operations and frontline workers every day is super high. They're working long hours day after day, and it's leading to burnout, lower efficiencies, attrition, and it's just further exacerbating an already very challenging issue. Some of these issues are likely going to subside over the next few months, but there are others going to be longer term. And I think we as a society and as a business community are going to have to ultimately respond to those changes, including expectations of what workers value in their employment and their employers. So with that, let's meet our panelists. We have a wonderful, diverse group today that I'm super excited to introduce. And I'm going to start off with Corey Gilchrist from Shamrock Foods. Corey, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm the Vice President of Total Rewards and HRIS at Shamrock Foods Company. We're a regional food distribution company and a national milk production and distribution company. I've been working in the HR arena for about 11 years. Prior to that, I grew up and played around in the public accounting, finance, IT, and operations management type roles. So I'm happy to be here with you guys today from Phoenix, Arizona.
Awesome. Thank you, Corey. Kevin, why don't you go next?
Yeah, well, thanks, Steve. I'm happy to be here as well. Kevin Schoen, and I'm retired. I was 34 years with General Mills, maker of Cheerios and Yoplait yogurt and other food that people love. And I spend my time now in a consulting or an advisory role. I typically have 4 to 6 companies that I'm advising from mostly North America, but from around the globe. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. I spent most of my career in supply chain. My last many years, I was the head of our North American supply chain. And we spent a lot of time on people. We had over 12,000 people in our organization. And a lot of our time was in discussions around people and building their capabilities. And it's actually exciting to see the frontline workers having kind of a front row seat to the current discussion more broadly. And I'm sure we'll be interested to hear more from our panelists on how that looks from each of their chairs.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Bob, would you mind going next?
No, I'd be glad to. Steve, thanks. And my name is Bob King. I'm in Seattle, Washington area, and started my career in and around manufacturing plants in the paper industry with Georgia Pacific. Was there for 20-some years in their manufacturing and distribution units, and I went from there to president of a large office products manufacturing company for 10 years, and then maybe 10, 12 years ago started C.O.O. Services, which works with mid-sized manufacturers on efficiencies and opportunities to improve their performance.
Thank you. A lot of deep manufacturing expertise on this. Doug Hammond, let's get a little bit of intro from you.
All right, thanks, Steve. Well, I'm Doug Hammond from Chicago, and I appreciate you having me here. I am Zone President in Randstad's in-house services division. We focus on high-volume custom labor solutions for our clients, so this topic's near and dear to my heart. Prior to that, I was with an HR technology startup, and I started my career as a manufacturing engineer at Motorola years ago.
Perfect. Thanks, Doug. And one thing to kind of note is now Doug's division, they have a lot of big manufacturers as customers, and we thought it would be very interesting to have someone who, is in the business of supplying contingent labor to these organizations and being able to get that perspective, since the employee perspective is kind of a big one as part of this discussion. So thank you, Doug, and thank you to all of our panelists who are here today. So with that, let's dive into the first question. And I think a good one is to set a baseline, just to kind of kick things off of really, the two perspectives, which is one, an operational perspective, more the business perspective, and also the employee perspective around kind of what flexibility is. So Doug, I'm going to actually ask you to kind of lead things off. And what does flexibility look like from both an individual employee and a plant manager perspective?
You know, Steve, I appreciate the question because I think flexibility is a really interesting topic. I mean, clearly it means different things to different stakeholders, and to really get it right, you have to think through it for everyone involved. So, you know, for instance, you know, what's in it for each group? What problem are you trying to solve? And most importantly, you know, how is flexibility connected to the overall goals of the business? So if we think about some of these groups, think about your white collar employees, for instance, you know, they're probably looking for some level of geographic flexibility. You know, we've heard about this migration from some of the major city centers to all over the country as the pandemic taught us, especially in the white collar world, that work didn't necessarily have to be done in the same places that we thought it would have to be done. They might also be looking for some schedule flexibility to a lesser extent, although, you know, I think that white collar population of workers has really been pushing the envelope on schedule flexibility anyways. But if we think about hourly employees, you know, that's where it starts to get pretty interesting because they're really looking for flexibility that allows them to accommodate the unexpected things that happen in their life, like a kid getting sick or school getting canceled or an unexpected doctor's appointment or, you know, or even loss of childcare, right? These folks value the kind of flexibility that lets them work when they're available and doesn't penalize them when something comes up and keeps them from being available. And if you find this solution that helps them while still meeting the needs of the business, that's invariably going to result in more retention and higher productivity. And employers who get this right are going to find themselves highly competitive in a tight labor market when it comes to attracting and keeping workers, which is, you know, top of mind for everyone right now in this labor market. You know, speaking of employers, what they really want are outcomes that give them better value for their labor dollar, right? And they want to achieve this without creating significant risk or uncertainty in their business operations. It may be easier said than done, but still, you know, the good news is that at the end of the day, flexibility can and should be a win for everyone involved. If you're using a framework that all stakeholders understand and they bought into, you get business outcomes with great results. And we've seen this over and over again.
Great introduction. Other panelists, why don't we kind of just spiral off of Doug's kind of opening comments and jump in.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that crosses my mind, Doug, when I hear you talk about that is that you always have to keep the company goals in mind, and the flexibility and the ability to work in different ways or different patterns needs to be meshed well with the business goals. So the goal is not just about flexible scheduling or flexible workforce, it's also a flexible workforce along with performance with the organization.
I think one of the key things Doug mentioned was know what problem needs to be solved. That can be different for different departments, different plants, different cities. But always understanding what problem you need to solve with a flexibility solution is going to be key to success.
Yeah, I was going
to say, Corey, could you mind just providing an example of what that might be, you know, for example?
Yeah, sure. For example, like within manufacturing lines, right? Your flexibility might not involve working from home, something that simple that would work for white collar workers, right? As Doug mentioned, you know, those types of workers are looking for more accommodations to the unexpected. And so we've experienced that in several of our departments within the company. We have warehouse jobs that don't have a lot of flexibility that mirrors what our accounting department's flexibility or our IT department's flexibility looks like. So there are different areas, different cities, and each one could be a little different.
Yeah, I was just going to add that like politics, since we just had an election, labor issues are often local. There are some definite national trends that we're seeing, but a lot of the solutions may be local solutions. And I think that's particularly challenging for larger companies that tend to want to have a policy that spans across all of their organizations, all their locations, and all their employees. And that makes good sense too. But a lot of times, if you look at the needs for flexibility that Doug was describing, they can vary quite a bit depending on what geography you're in and what the needs of that specific geography are at the time.
Yeah, that's a good point. And even probably within, a single geography, I mean, flexibility means different things to different employees. And there's an advertisement out right now from Amazon talking about, the person that needs to just work evenings versus the person that needs time off to be able to take their kids on Tuesdays and Thursdays somewhere. So I think that whole notion of providing flexibility gets compounded and more complicated because employees need different things from their employer at different times. So it can a lot of different faces for sure. In terms of just, we're hitting on this first topic just to kind of set up the conversation and kind of contrast between the, operational view of flexibility and the employee view of flexibility. And we're going to get into some strategies kind of next, but is there any kind of key kind of contrasting points that are kind of important to kind of get out now in terms of either, a real tension point between maybe an employee's needs around flexibility and operational as we try to kind of tease out ultimately the different viewpoints and how they can kind of come together, as Doug mentioned, right? There's lots of win-wins that are kind of available here. But when you get down to the fundamental tension point, I guess I want to kind of go back to something both kind of Corey and Kevin said, and Bob, you as well, which is that tension between productivity and getting product out the door and meeting customer commitments, while trying to balance and not burn out your employees and run them 12 hours a day every single day. With the labor shortages going on, is that the key tension point, or are there others that we want to kind of just highlight as kind of our baseline into the next set of questions?
Well, I think one thing to think about, Steve, is as you were describing that problem, is let's try and simplify the problems as well, not boil the ocean. And there's a lot of attention on the labor issue right now, in a good way. I think we can't waste this crisis. I mean, COVID brought to the light that frontline workers matter, and as a supply chain leader, I love to hear that. I felt like over the years we've kind of eroded the value of some of our frontline workers, whether they were hourly or white collared. Now they're in the front. Now they're in the sort of in the front of the discussion, and then obviously the labor shortage is adding another dimension. But let's not forget, if you were trying to get a third shift employee in a specific location, they were always hard to find. I mean, that's why we gave shift differentials to folks in the off shifts. And so, looking at the problem and saying, okay, what's new relative to flexibility versus what we've always, dealt with, and sort of simplifying it down into what are those maybe 2 or 3 key things, and that's maybe what you're teasing out here in your question, versus what are the things that are always going to exist in employees and trying to meet the business needs. I think is one key approach to think about if you're an employer trying to answer this question around what does flexibility really mean and how can it help me attract and retain more employees.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And maybe that's a great introduction into kind of our stepping stone into our next topic, which is really what role does workforce flexibility play in terms of productivity and operational efficiency? And Kevin, since you were so kind to kind of add the last comment on the last question, why don't you go first on this one?
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'll keep this short so we can hear from some of the other panelists as well. Obviously, productivity is a key driver to any supply chain organization or any organization from the employee point of view. And Doug and Bob, I think, made one of the key contrasting things that you were just talking about, Steve. There's the needs of the business that Bob described that we can't forget. We can't get so lost on what are the needs of the rest of the attributes of a business that we forget to focus that there are business needs, and we need to understand what those are and clearly be able to articulate those to the employees. And then to Doug's point, and I don't think we do this enough, I know we haven't historically, we're starting to do it more because of the nature of the conversation, is what do the employees really want and need? And I think one of the key drivers to increasing the productivity of your workforce and the productivity of your organization is, as leaders in these companies, is taking that new point of view, is sitting down and really thinking about that question. What do the employees need? What is their definition of flexibility? All the things that we've heard described here already today. And how could we develop a creative plan that is going to help attract and retain folks through the lens of flexibility? I'll just give one quick example. I've got a niece that works in nursing. She's in her mid-20s, late 20s now, right out of college, and she loves flexibility. She has, one young son. Her definition of flexibility, she's a frontline worker. She has hourly slots that she has to meet. She could be on any of one of three shifts, any week. Her definition of flexibility is visibility. I want visibility to my schedule 2 months out, 3 months out, 4 months out, so I can plan. She's a planner. And when I ask her about this question, she goes, "You mean flexibility or visibility?" And I'm like, "Yes, that's what I mean." And so she kind of boiled it down into my flexibility is through visibility, and I also want an easy way to do that. And so she threw in a third word that I liked, usability. And so the hospital system that she works for down in Kansas City has a pretty flexible technological app and way to keep in tune with her on her scheduling and the visibility out in her schedule. A lot of what you guys do there, Steve, at Shiftboard, where you're trying to use technology to lessen the friction between the employees, the employer's needs, and the flexibility and needs of the employee. And it's just interesting to see one of these millennials like my niece describe it in a way that I hadn't thought of. I always think about the flexibility of coming and going and different hours or different shifts, and she really described it as, I like to see further into the future, and then that gives me the flexibility that I need to to live my life.
Yeah, good points on the employee side, and just visibility as being one flavor of flexibility. We also often hear certain employees talking about just consistency of schedule, right? Because consistency is more valued than flexibility at some point. So I guess going back to that point of different employees looking at it from a slightly different lens. On the side of the employer side, in terms of the how to view flexibility and how to maybe some tactics and strategies around how manufacturers today are trying to leverage workforce flexibility. From the rest of the panel, what are your observations?
Well, a couple thoughts, Steve, that come to mind. Back on what Kevin was saying a minute ago, is that the premium on having quality conversation between the workers who are wondering what they want in terms of flexibility, and listening to that well enough to know what problem, back to Doug, what problem you're trying to solve for them and work with the group. But the communication piece, I think about it just came to mind as hearing Kevin talk, is I'll say back in my day, the communication or the ease of communication was way more difficult. The technology that's available today and the timeliness of the technologies that's available today give you a lot more opportunity to get into some of the detailed scheduling changes that get made on an hourly basis in some of these plants. And, getting into using technology to help improve that level of communication, I think is essential. It's one of the basic steps that's got to happen to really make this work well. So I just wanted to camp on that a little bit, Kevin, before we got too far. I think this whole idea of communication and technology has to be part of the solution.
Yeah, good point. Is any of the manufacturers you've worked with leveraging things like flex pools or groups of employees who maybe have multi-skill sets or various ways to kind of flow flow headcount to the point of need in terms of, is that a strategy being deployed by any of the manufacturers you're involved in?
Right now, the only real technology-enabled thing that I've seen my clients working with is bidding for openings. That openings are now being able to be put, changes in schedule or openings are being able to put up on some kind of board, and people can bid on those almost immediately to fill or empty whatever they're going to do. That's I don't want to say basic, but a fairly basic way of helping some kind of flexibility and short-term, quick turnaround type, needs.
All right, Doug, anything from your side?
Yeah, Steve, I'll tell you, we've got a number of clients that we've developed labor solutions with that have flexible labor pools as a critical part of the solution that's been put in place. And, I think one of the points that I really want to make sure we bring home on this webinar is that flexibility doesn't have to mean like no rules, it's the wild, wild west. And in fact, I think the best labor solutions have flexibility within specific guardrails that are directly linked to the business outcomes that employers need to accomplish. And so, it's less, you're less likely to see with our client base full schedule flexibility where, workers can just decide to come and work for 3 hours or 5 hours, one day, 2 hours the next, 10 hours the next. That's a lot of flexibility that's hard to accommodate on the manufacturing or the logistics floor. But day scheduled flexibility is something that's very easy to accommodate. And we have found that when we give workers the opportunity to say, yes, for this coming week, I'm going to work first shift Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, they come to work because they've chosen those days. Those days match their own personal needs within their own lives, and they're much more likely to adhere to the schedule that they signed up for than someone you just tell, hey, you're going to work Monday through Friday on second shift, and oh, by the way, non-voluntary overtime Saturday and Sunday too. Right.
That's a great point you make. I think when you get into a position where you can do that and allow employees to pick those days or be a little bit more flexible, you're going to have a lot less call-offs, which are all of our worst nightmares, right? When you get the call-offs an hour before the shift starts, which with the current shortage going on, it even complicates it even more, right? Because you're already running lean and mean. And so the more predictive we can be about who's going to be there on whatever given day, the better off our manufacturing or other lines will be, right? We'll know we'll know what to expect a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Corey. I think I'm assuming, I haven't heard pay come up so much right now in terms of kind of as a driver of potentially incenting, some additional capacity. Is that tapped at this point? Just kind of curious from your perspectives. Pay has been the easy carrot, right? That's been kind of thrown out to have, workers, work those extra, 5-10% of the, hours. But with the current labor shortage, are you finding that's already a tactic that's been checked off, and you're moving on to other types of things? Just interested to see how much pay is still a motivator for increasing capacity.
I'd love to comment on pay.
Yeah,
that's been a fun one. This entire year has been a whirlwind of compensation changes for not only white collar but blue collar, right? I mean, in the beginning we were seeing in the month of January of this year, driver, like CDL driver wages, they were jumping 6 to 12% within 30 days, because everybody was short and the economy was starting to open up. And so it's almost as if we as employers got into bidding wars, right? Who's going to pay the most? Who's going to give the biggest sign-on bonus? And that went crazy for several months, and it's slowed down a little bit, but it's still present. But every time there's a change in a local market, right, we have to be ready to shift to that market, whatever's happening, whether it's somebody else is opening up better or somebody's got a major shortage of employees and they throw out a massive sign-on bonus or a higher wage. We have to be willing and ready to react if we want to stay employed ourselves. My hope is that it will all calm down and everything will settle and we'll be able to at least, I don't know, cruise control for a while. But it's been a crazy year for sure with respect to compensation.
You know, Steve, I don't think compensation will ever leave this conversation, right? I mean, it's one of the 4 or 5, you know, pieces of the package. You've got compensation, you've got the flexibility, you've got benefits, you've got corporate culture. These things all mix together, and I would argue that anybody, anytime, could be incented with some level of compensation. The question is, what do you have to do and keep the corporate goals in mind, and how much can you either improve efficiencies or how much can you pass along to your clients to cover those additional costs? At some level, you've got to moderate it or your markets won't tolerate the cost increase. But it's definitely part of the equation. I think it'll continue to remain.
Yeah, money talks always in terms of, you know, certainly not the end all like it maybe, you know, could have been.
It's a temporary solution a lot of the times, right?
Yeah. Right.
Well, I just think it's critical to know where you sit in terms of, you know, pay in your specific labor market, right? Because if you are paying at below an attraction wage, wages are still going to continue to be an important part of your strategy to change things. But as you approach sort of, you know, median wages in your market, you know, now you can start competing on, you know, meeting other needs in your labor force. And, you know, we're here to talk about flexibility. That really starts to play in. But yeah, I mean, if you're too low, then, you know, it's going to be part of your conversation for a while to come, for sure.
But the other thing, Steve, we haven't talked about much, and maybe we should, is a little bit on this whole idea of training and what employees are trained to do at these various jobs in regard to flexibility, because certain folks can't work in certain positions because they haven't been trained to do those jobs. You know, I think of how the airlines schedule captains, you know, airline pilots, right? The ones with the most experience and the high levels of training get to bid first on any airplane in the system and go anywhere they want. The person who's the brand new pilot, who's got less experience and less tenure, and is only 737 qualified, their options are fewer in terms of flexibility. So there's this training continuum, I think, in manufacturing, certainly on machines and machinery and safety issues, et cetera, that come into play that in some ways limits the amount of flexibility you can have based on the qualifications of the employees needing to work.
And Bob, just because I know you work with a lot of different clients, are you seeing companies respond to that with you know, trying to expand training initiatives and things like such as that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas I've been most impressed with is, you know, companies that have a good culture and they have, you know, pay that's reasonable and good. They're looking for additional ways to continue to keep employees engaged, and training is one of them that there's been a lot of focus on. And it's not just about the machine they're working on. You know, it can be all kinds of things, including formal schooling. But that's a differentiator. And of course, the more training you have, the more ability you have to work in more environments, and that increases your ability to be flexible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, Steve, tying back to the pay, what Bob is saying there. I've got a company right now that's in a really competitive labor market. for manufacturing jobs, and they're a notch above the entry-level manufacturing roles, and they're losing people right and left. And they've done the pay thing. 2 big increases there. Still hasn't slowed it down much. So taking a completely different approach, we're actually upping the training level fairly significantly of several of the high-speed automated packaging lines so that they can do some of the maintenance as well as some of the other safety checks that Bob described, and get them in a whole different pay zone. They're very engaged from the training point of view. They like that because they're getting poured into, but they also like the fact that they can move up the pay scale while staying there. They don't have to change jobs because the culture is pretty healthy as well. And so training can be a strategy on the pay side as well as on the employee engagement and flexibility side. And it's one of those that I've got a couple clients that's not just looking at it, they're in the process of executing it.
Right. Which kind of flows back into that concept of, flex pools and so forth. Is, employees who have multiple skill sets that can be put into different positions. It's, that's, back to Doug's theme of win-wins, right? That's a big win-win for both the manufacturer and the employee if they can, serve up multiple needs on different lines and keep the line going. So, well, good. Well, we've teased out quite a bit, I think, around just the whole concept of what flexibility can mean in terms of that. Why don't we kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about just, kind of tactics and strategies that that employers could take. So, Corey, I'm going to have you kind of take this one. What do you consider to be the most important first steps when launching a flexible workforce initiative?
Sure, I'd love to tackle this one. We've talked about a lot of it already, though, right? I think the most important thing to understand is the problem that we're trying to solve. If we go after this without trying to solve a problem, we're just creating a program to have a program, or we're even going to potentially create a new problem that doesn't exist for us. So have a defined problem and go after that and approach and attack that, right? That problem, it might be a safety problem. During the pandemic, we have some meat cutting lines, and our flexibility was a lot different. It wasn't sending people home, it was spacing them out and letting them work in different areas to keep the social distancing, if you will. It might be a recruiting problem that we've already talked about, right? And you might have, a need for a lot of IT workers, and everybody's offering mass flexibility for IT workers, right? You can work literally from anywhere in the world that you want to, and you have to be flexible enough to accommodate your needs as a business, but to compete from that recruiting perspective. So understanding that problem is key to the entire thing. And so from there, you get into a whole bunch of other things we've discussed: flexibility by job, flexibility by location. What do they look like? How are they defined? Understanding what the employees think flexibility means, because if their definition of flexibility is very different than yours as management, you're going to create a program that doesn't accommodate them, and they're not going to be happy, especially the blue collar jobs, right? They won't be happy if your definitions aren't aligned. And so getting that in alignment is great. I think one of the biggest things we found when we started obviously the pandemic threw us into a very flexible workforce, but we found that engagement, or let's see, there were a bunch of managers that we found that weren't necessarily on board with flexibility, even in departments that you could accommodate virtually any type of flexibility, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's very key to understand which management members are on board with it, which ones aren't on board, and try to figure out, okay, why aren't they on board, and how do we resolve those concerns? How do we help them understand flexibility and how it might work in their arena? Because last thing we need is a program that's created and a bunch of headbutting and resistance at the management level and preventing it from rolling out to the associates. Yeah. So I think those are the key starting points.
Yeah, that's good ones. And if there's, a lot of times those managers who are resistant probably have some valid concerns, and you can kind of get those out early in the process and figure out which ones are ones you can address and which ones you can't. And it probably helps everybody get aligned. Yeah, really good kickoff to that. Others jump in. That's a great kickoff, Corey.
I think one of the things that's really useful is to understand what sort of sacred cows might be brought to the forefront with a change in how the labor and production happens in your facility. And I'll give you an example. One of the most, as it turns out, controversial topics that we end up discussing with our clients is either an elimination or a radical change to the attendance policy, right? I mean, lots of companies have put lots of time into defining how, points are given, points are earned, points are lost, points are tracked. So, it's a whole points thing. And you can eliminate or radically change that with some of these flexible work arrangements while still holding people accountable. We have a solution that we've got in place with a client where, people are held accountable for showing up the shifts that they sign up for. They're not accountable if they only choose to work, 3 days a week instead of 5, as long as they come on the 3 days that they say they're going to come to. But then it's a one strike rule. You don't come on a day that you said you were going to, and you move into a B tier employee. And if you do it again, you're out, and we're just not going to schedule you anymore. So, you still have accountability, but it's a real conversation if you go to a client and say that you think you need to blow up the attendance policy, because especially if they think that a point system is fundamental to getting people to come to work. And, we can debate that philosophically or not, but if it's a sacred cow, you gotta call it out and work through it up front.
Mm-hmm. Steve, another thing that comes to mind on a startup, getting started on something like this, we've talked about kind of what problem are we solving, right? Or what are we trying to get done? The other part of it is, what's the goal, right? What's the outcome we're looking for as a result of doing all this work? So once we understand what the problem we're trying to solve, is the goal increase productivity, or is the goal equal productivity and less turnover of people? What are we after, so that we can develop an idea of, are we being successful implementing what we've implemented? So you start with kind of the mind, what are we trying to get to, and are the things we've done in between here and there, the tactical moves we've made, are they working? Are they getting us to where we want to get to? But I guess just establishing some kind of goals, parameters for what you're trying to accomplish would be helpful.
Yeah. On that topic, in terms of just metrics, ways to establish mileposts along the way, to that point, when it comes to these types of things where you are, having to probably get pretty creative at some of these organizations to try to address the immediate impact, right? What are some of those milepost kind of markers that would allow an organization to see if some of their more creative exercises are paying off?
Yeah, I think a simple one, if you're talking around the workforce itself, is a measurement around attendance / compliance to whatever it is you're trying and you're checking on. And one of the things I'm learning in the advisory roles that I'm doing versus what I thought I knew in my previous role was, we used to, my role when I was leading an organization, when we got ready to make a change, we would think a lot about it, especially if it involved policy and people and scheduling and shifts and those sorts of things. And so I would say I mostly had the, measure 3 times, cut once sort of a policy. And, for the most part, that works well if you, as an employee or employer, you're calling the shots, and employees sort of have to comply to whatever it is you're coming up with, even if you get a lot of input from them. And we used to do a lot of self-designed work systems, and we would do all of the legwork, maybe 6-9 months of that, and then we deploy the new work system in a plant or in a part of a plant. And but within that, it was a democracy, so whoever majority would rule. But there's also a bunch of folks in the tail that maybe didn't agree with that, and I've much more come to the conclusion that it's better to do some of these, what I call low-cost probes. So just try some things in a small area, maybe with one shift in one section of the plant or one section of a packaging line, and see what happens. And of course, get a lot of input and communicate with your employees, and then measure whatever it is that was the problem that caused you to want to change to begin with, whether it was attendance or whether it was non-compliance to your work schedule. And I've got a plant now I'm advising in. I've been floored by their willingness to try these things. They're actually running a 4-crew system in one part of the plant, but they started up in weeks. They're running a traditional three-shift system in another part on the same floor. And they're running a sort of a, I call it a hybrid system in yet another part of the plant. And they're doing low-cost probes in 3, and they're going to run them for 3 months and then see, do they end up with hybrids or something in between? I never would have taken that approach in the past. I would have been much more about, let's figure out the best solution for everybody and try and deploy it across the site or a section of the site. And I think we're going to need to be more creative in that sort of a way as leaders going forward.
That's a great point, and it ties back to, I think, some of the challenges you even set up front, right? Which is, define the problem, but also kind of, determine where maybe some of the resistance points are and having to get those out on the table. And if you're having to do that across, 40 managers versus 3 managers, right? and be a little bit more micro about it. That's a great statement. Kevin, just follow-up question, and I'm sure everybody else has probably got a view of this as well, is, how, like in the example you gave, right, of that plan that's willing to try something, what kind of the key ingredients there? Is it just kind of a plant manager who's kind of a champion of that idea, or was it more organic, coming from a couple of shift leaders or something that put their hand up? Where does that, how do you set that? Any suggestions on how to get that kind of culture going, I guess, to just be able to be maybe a little bit more spontaneous and try things?
Yeah, I'd say there are a couple things that I've witnessed so far. One is for sure the plant manager and that direct leadership team, very open to ideas. And it started right there. They're we're willing to listen, and they're and listen, not only just listen, but take things and run with it. But I'd say the main ingredient was it was just pain. It was painful. I mean, they were having to shut down parts of the plant. It was painful for the employees. I mean, we're humans, right? I mean, these folks on the floor, when you're having to go through these painful situations, whether you're one of the shift workers having to endure it and being forced on overtime to cover one of the people that didn't show up, or whether you're the leadership team and you're having to explain to your owners or your leaders that, we didn't run any this weekend because we couldn't get employees. I'd say that's one of the ingredients too. So don't waste the crisis is another thing that I've seen. But obviously, you need a leadership team that's willing to try some things. And, and in my case, if I go back to when I was the supply chain leader, that tone really starts at the top of the house. So for those HR leaders, supply chain leaders, ops leaders, plant managers that are listening to the call, I think the first place we have to look to is ourselves and say, are we really willing to, take the risk, so to speak, into trying some of these new things?
Yeah, really good points.
The other thing that comes to Kevin that's interesting to me is it doesn't have to be a corporate program to get going, right? You've got multi-plant locations, you've got shift, supervised. I mean, it can be started and tried in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways without having to wait for it to come down from on high. A good plant manager, a good shift manager, an ops manager can get some of this stuff started and beta it without having to wait for some program.
Yeah, good point. We have a customer we recently closed that just kind of went through their process of selection and so forth, and it was pretty interesting. They had a number of employees on their selection committee. And they're trying to solve a workforce flexibility challenge. Ultimately, we're just the technology that kind of helps that. But I thought that was a really good idea on their part, right? Because they were able to kind of bridge the ops leader down to the shift managers, down to the actual workers that were there. And it really forced them into a brainstorming mode together to where they all were able to kind of get on the same page around a couple ways they could go about it. And like they're going to explore voluntary overtime because they think they have enough employees who want the overtime that doesn't force it on everybody else, right? And so it kind of affected some of these fundamental principles, Doug, to your point, right? Those holy grail kind of topics, right? Whether it's absenteeism or voluntary overtime or whatever those hot buttons are, you getting a way to get those out on the table and get the right parties together early, and maybe do it in a cell fashion, Kevin, that you're mentioning, right? Do it at a small scale and let some evidence come out on the table, and that can in itself be the spark plug for the energy to make a broader initiative.
I think that example Kevin shared where they broke it down into individual areas is a good example of where the mindset change comes into play, right? And understanding that we don't necessarily operate as a plant as a whole when it comes to schedules. We have all these little sub units or sub jobs even within the plant that can define flexibility differently. And I think key to that is management understanding the data behind each job. Like what does productivity mean for this job in this corner of the building versus that job? And when you understand that and you translate that into man hours and other productivity measurements, now you start opening up your flexibility. All right, how can we hit those numbers in a more flexible fashion that works here, but maybe not over here? We have to do a different mathematical formula over here. And so I really like that example that client of yours is doing.
Yeah, that was a good springboard for talking about kind of the things you can do here and now. Let's shift to kind of our last kind of angle on this, which is let's look forward, right? Let's think about more kind of strategic in terms of being able to build some operational resiliency, and also just how to kind of address probably some of these longer term workforce flexibility issues that I think organizations are going to have to face. Bob, why don't you kick this one off for us?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. We've talked about a lot of the challenges or the things up front. One that we haven't, that you had described earlier, you were talking about tension points, the flexibility versus organizational goals, for example. I think one of the down the road tension points, if you will, is the balance for the senior leaders allocating resources between automation or whether to automate or not in certain parts of these facilities. So there's a tension between workforce flexibility and the ability to automate to actually eliminate portions of the workforce or move portions of the workforce to another part of the plant. And I do think for the leadership people that are listening today, that's a big one. And where do you put your resources? Where do you allocate capital? Do you continue to work towards the workforce end? Do you try to automate? Is it a balance between the two? But I think that's a question that's going to have to be answered, shortly. It's not that far down the line. The other piece is this idea of training, the ability to bring people inside the organization up the training ladder so that they have the flexibility to work from section of the plant to another section of the plant, from this line to that line, as you're starting to plan your year forward, and how that training could impact flexibility and agility, I think is really key. So those are the things that I would tee up. The idea of automation and the real emphasis on training to enable flexibility.
Yeah, I don't think we can emphasize cross-training and the value of that enough. I think we've probably all seen, multiple examples of a line getting shut down mid-shift for whatever reason, absence of parts, or maybe they met their production goals, or any number of reasons, and that entire workforce getting sent home while the line next to it's running shorthanded. And I mean, that's crazy, but that's the world we live in, without enough foresight to sort of build in these cross-training frameworks that allow you to build, labor pools that are, qualified to work in multiple parts of the facility. But, when you hit that, you really start optimizing your labor dollar.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, the one add that I would build on both of what you guys are saying is, that whole training and workforce flexibility is key. But I also think about that additional level of training beyond sort of being able to run A machine and B machine. And it's investing in the overall development of your workforce. And this was an issue that, has been on the radar, at least when I was at General Mills back in that 2012, 2013, 2014 time frame, before we're in the crisis we're in now. And it was a question around the millennial workforce. Who are we going to attract to work in these factories and these plants? What's going to excite them? What kind of training and capabilities are we going to need to build into them? And of course, they were already demanding some different levels of flexibility. And when I looked at who we were hiring, we weren't hiring many folks that we were hiring 15 years before that might be a really well-trained vocational school kid that's 20, 25 years old and excited to come work in a production facility. We were getting folks that were from a much different pool of people. And so we could see that we needed to do something on the training and the skill piece. And then the question is, what skills do you give them beyond just the skills and flexibility we're describing? And I think that's something every organization needs to look into, whether it's continuous improvement skills or whether it's life skills, whether it's conflict resolution skills within the teams, communication skills, all those sort of second order skills beyond the basic floor that really start to crank up your productivity as an organization, whether it's because you need fewer people or whether the ones you have are really effective. So it's a hard one to think about right now as you queue up the question of what's the future look like, but I think it's going to be one that emerges once we're past the crisis that we are viewing right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kevin. I mean, if you can't hire the right traditional demographic, then how do you develop it? The labor supply that's out there. You can look at it like it's a limited thing, and the classic candidate may be less in numbers, but that doesn't mean there's a whole population that you can get to that point by taking on some of the task of doing that and not just expecting it to be available for sure. Classic kind of development programs that maybe were, things that high potential, traditional employees might be on. You're starting programs like that being moved down into the frontline ranks, which is awesome, right? I mean, it's really good signals that are going on there. On that topic, anybody hear of some interesting things that clients have been doing around developing frontline workers? Beyond that, just simple A/B, checking out on line A versus line B, or machine A versus machine B.
One of my clients is getting involved in this.
Runs a weld school within the facility. They're welding carts and tables and movable sort of steel objects, and they're living the labor shortage, the skilled labor shortage. And so we bring in more entry-level folks, administer a testing regimen for them, and then move people into a paid after-work weld school that the client runs in order to manufacture their own welding labor base.
That's a great example. Bob,
Yeah, I was going to say, one of my clients is involved in just getting involved actually in something called, I'm looking at it now, Employer Resource Network, which actually is an interesting outside group that helps employees with all kinds of things, including improving their credit reports and applying for loans for mortgages and the kind of skill type stuff, as well as things that are happening there at work. So And I agree with that. It's a great retention tool. It's a great way to help people, train people. But, when you're talking about employee turnover, there's a lot of components that go into it. And, workforce flexibility is one, training is one, your company culture. I mean, there's a lot to it. It's not just one topic.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Corey, anything from you before we kind of move to wrapping up and just kind of key points from this?
Yeah, I just touching base on what the future looks like, right? I think the pandemic proved to us that, or to many employers, that we can do business differently. And it sure opened the door up for a lot of change that might not have been thought about in the past. And anybody that's going to try to return back to the way things used to be, I think is going to have lots of different fights on their hands going forward. And so I love the fact that the pandemic did open our eyes to change, right? And the businesses that survived learned from it. And those that didn't may not have learned from it or been able to learn from it, just depending on their circumstance. But we're definitely going to see different work forces, different work strategies, different work schedules. And so the future, I think we're just touching base on it right now, right? With these changes that we were forced into.
Yeah, great. I think, challenges like this put the light bulbs on for a lot of people, and there's going to be a lot of innovative things that we're going to hear about over the next year or two as companies, really figure out the recipe to get around some of the challenges. There's always ways around. I mean, we've always learned that through history, that's for sure. Well, good. Let's move to wrap up. So we, what I'm kind of ask is that, we're kind of do a little bit of just around the circle of kind of like what are the one or two kind of key takeaway points that you'd like to make sure the audience kind of hears. And I'll jump in first, and that makes it's easiest for me because I've just been listening the whole time to a lot of great points. But I think one of the themes that kind of kept jumping out at me that was kind of threading through conversations was just the whole notion of getting the thoughts around opportunities and what innovative programs you can do out on the table. Get the right parties lined up, right? Don't forget about your employees. Don't forget about those frontline managers who may be resistant, right? But kind of go after the problem less, like Kevin, the way you framed it up, right? Less holistically and like the perfect program and try stuff, right? And if you can kind of try stuff and get all the parties kind of at the table to come in with good ideas, a little bit more of like a brainstorming, tiger team kind of approach. That was one thing that certainly resonated with me as a great tactic to take going forward. So Bob, since you're top left, at least on my screen, why don't we start with you for your closing comments, and we'll go around the horn.
Yeah, thanks. It really strikes me as the whole idea of making sure you know what the employees are really looking for, right? And start working on solutions with them to solve those problems or challenges, along with keeping the company goals in mind. That's really what I think this is all about. I mean, if employers can really think about it in a way that says, if we can get to where we need to get and allow maximum flexibility, then everybody wins, that it becomes a win-win scenario. And that's really what we endeavor to get to, is really a win-win piece. So that's kind of mine. The secondary one would be the whole training idea. Increase the ability to be flexible by increasing the amount of training that you're giving to or working with employees on.
Yeah, love that point. Love those points. Corey.
I think one of the key things is just be willing to fail in your attempts to create these flexible programs, right? I mean, we've talked about the diversity of how this could play out. So start small and grow from there, right? It's always easier to add to a flexibility program than it is to take away. Keeping in mind the P&L, right? Don't do it at the punishment of the P&L. Those goals of the company are still foremost the most important thing to do. But at the same time, we have to stay competitive We have to meet employee needs with the changing workforce, as we're all seeing. And yeah, just work fast, but work smart as you're developing these plans, and be flexible.
Yeah, good ones. Kevin?
Yeah, I totally concur with what with what Bob and Corey are saying, and what you mentioned too, Steve. I think the one different one that we haven't talked a lot about, but I think we need to really think about, and I've heard pieces of this, is we seem to know a lot of the basics of what needs to be done with our, with attracting employees and retaining them and developing them. It's not brand new to us, but I think it's gotten highlighted with where we're at. The one that we haven't, really seen applied yet, it's more of a how, is the technology applied to it. And I just think about how much my life has changed personally in the last 15 years with the advent of smartphones, and how little we sort of apply that to the frontline workers. And I think about the policies I had when I was still working, and we wouldn't allow people to take phones on floors a lot of times, especially if they had cameras. And it's like the attendance policies Doug were talking about. I mean, they were all there for really good reasons. But I think we need to relook at that and see if there's a place that we can leverage technology to really get at some of the other great ideas and other discussions that we had here today.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of, there's so many technologies that are out there today, from, everything as alternatives to, the smartphones on the floor to, you hear about manufacturing floors with, robots delivering parts, right, and all kinds of other, stuff. I mean, there's this a limitless, level of innovative companies out there that are certainly trying to deliver this. So great point. So Doug, we started with you. We're going to end with you. So Doug, give us your final thoughts.
It's hard to give final thoughts after 4 people go before you and give a lot of great final thoughts. So, but I think maybe let me leave everyone with this. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome, right? And I know that's cliche, but it's true. And, Kevin got to this point as well, but, if employers are conducting business the same way they did 5 years ago with no changes, they're getting left behind, because, the world shifted. The world shifted hard, and it was moving as it was. And so, there's a lot of value in looking creatively to find solutions that meet business and employees' needs. Don't be scared that change means no rules. I think it just means different rules. But to be concerned about doing anything and have that paralyze you from doing anything, I think is going to be a real problem. As Corey made a comment about, other employers maybe not making it. And, if we think post-pandemic, the world's going to look like it was pre-pandemic, it really isn't. We've done some polling. We do quite a bit of work in the call center space, and our work from home call center space just grew exponentially through the pandemic as clients closed down their call center and sprinted to put these programs in where people could work from home. And we've started polling our workers on what they would need to see from a wage perspective in order to leave their home and come back into the call center. And you're talking 25 to 35% increases in wages in what people are saying would make it worthwhile for them to have to start paying gas again, have to buy professional dress, pay for lunch, all these different things. So I think it is really critical to keep an eye on what the future brings. These low-cost probes that Kevin talked about, I think are brilliant. That's absolutely a fantastic strategy to sort of test in a small way to find your way forward. And, you know, have a tool that gives you the power to do these experiments, I think is really important.
Yeah, good points by everybody. I mean, I think there's just in some, I think there were some, you know, good near-term things talked about today. You know, the whole training, the whole kind of tiger team concept of going after the problems in a more small contained thing, and don't try to solve everything at one time. But I think, you know, that ultimate theme that, you know, opportunities knocking on the door for all businesses right now, and you know, now's the time to step back and also think more fundamentally, you know, challenge some of those core premises that have been sitting there a long time, because likely your neighboring competitor is going to be doing that themselves. So you know, both need to be done, and where there's challenges, there's opportunity. So you know, companies are going to be surging ahead over the next 3 or 4 years out of this. It's might be painful now, but it'll lead to some pretty big cool changes that all of us will look back on and say, oh, that's so obvious, right? But it wasn't so obvious standing looking at it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, panelists, and thank you, audience. We're going to wrap things up now. Hope everybody enjoyed the webinar today, and have an awesome day. Thank you.